Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We tend to think of the apocalypse as an event, a moment when everything ends. But what if annihilation operates on a schedule? What if extinction arrives not through divine judgment or human folly, but through celestial mechanics as predictable as any planetary orbit? In 1976, British horror writer Ramsey Campbell introduced something unusual into the Lovecraft mythos. Ghroth, the Harbinger. Not a god. Not a monster dwelling in some sunken city. A comet. Or perhaps a rogue planet. The texts disagree, which is part of the problem. What they do agree on is this: Ghroth travels an elliptical path through our region of space, and when it passes near inhabited worlds, it emits what Campbell's fictional sources call a song. This transmission, whether acoustic or metaphysical, serves a single function: it wakes things that should remain asleep. Cthulhu drowned Relia. Zothamag in the abyssal trenches. Entities whose dormancy represents the only barrier between civilization and cosmic reorganization. What makes Ghroth particularly unsettling is its indifference. It doesn't hunt. It doesn't hunger. It simply follows its orbit, a clockwork harbinger announcing a scheduled catastrophe. Campbell gave us something more disturbing than malevolence. He gave us an apocalypse you can calculate, an ending you can see coming but cannot prevent. Ramsey Campbell entered the Lovecraft mythos as its youngest acolyte. In 1962, at age 16, he sent August Derleth a collection of stories set in Lovecraft's Arkham. Derleth published them, but with editorial advice that would shape Campbell's evolution: stop imitating, start innovating. Campbell took this instruction seriously. By the 1970s, he had relocated cosmic horror from New England to Britain's Severn Valley, replacing Lovecraft's New England Puritanism with something closer to Arthur Machen's pagan dread: nature as alien, landscape as host to intrusion. The Tugging, published in 1976, represents Campbell at his most astronomically minded. Unlike his earlier work, which rooted horror in specific locations, the Severn Valley, Goat's Wood, Brichester, this story gestured toward a threat operating on planetary scale. Ghroth appears not as local phenomenon but as recurring celestial event, something that has happened before and will happen again. Campbell's timing matters here. The mid-1970s saw growing cultural anxiety about extinction-level events, nuclear winter scenarios, environmental collapse projections, asteroid impact research gaining mainstream attention. Campbell wasn't writing about these fears directly. He was displacing them onto something older, more fundamental: the sky itself. What distinguishes Campbell's approach from Lovecraft's is philosophical precision. Lovecraft's cosmos was indifferent because his entities didn't notice humanity. Campbell's cosmos is indifferent because his entities operate as natural forces. Ghroth doesn't attack Earth. It doesn't even acknowledge Earth. It simply follows its orbit, and that orbit happens to pass through our region of space at intervals we could theoretically calculate. This shift, from cosmic indifference to cosmic mechanism, represented something new in the mythos. Not gods who don't care, but processes that can't care. The entity emerged during what we might call the post-Derleth correction. August Derleth had spent decades systematizing Lovecraft's work into elemental categories: good versus evil, a structure Lovecraft himself would have rejected. Campbell's generation, which included Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and others writing in the 1970s, sought to restore Lovecraft's original cosmic nihilism. Ghroth exemplifies this restoration. It cannot be classified as water entity or air entity. It doesn't serve Cthulhu or oppose him. It simply exists, moves, and in moving, changes everything. Campbell later described his intent as creating something that operated like weather, not like war. This distinction is crucial. Weather doesn't choose its targets. Weather doesn't negotiate. You can predict weather, prepare for it, but you cannot reason with it or prevent it. Ghroth functions identically, a harbinger in the oldest sense, announcing what cannot be stopped. Consider the implications of this approach. Lovecraft gave us entities we might avoid by not reading certain books, not visiting certain places, not knowing certain names. Campbell gave us an entity whose arrival depends on orbital mechanics. Knowledge offers no protection here. In fact, knowledge makes it worse. You know it's coming, you can calculate approximately when, and this certainty provides no comfort whatsoever. The horror shifts from revelation to anticipation, from what you discover to what you know is inevitable. This brings us to the broader landscape Campbell was writing into, a literary tradition of comets as harbingers stretching back centuries before Lovecraft ever put pen to paper. Comets have terrified humanity far longer than we've understood what they are. The distinction matters. Our ancestors feared comets as omens, but the translation of omen into physics didn't eliminate the dread. It merely changed its character. When Edmund Halley calculated his comet's 75-year orbit in 1705, he didn't dispel superstition. He gave humanity something potentially worse, the ability to anticipate celestial events without the comfort of believing divine intervention might prevent them. The panic surrounding Halley's comet in 1910 provides useful context for understanding Ghroth's cultural roots. Astronomers announced that Earth would pass through the comet's tail, and spectroscopic analysis revealed the presence of cyanogen gas, a compound used in chemical weapons. Never mind that the tail's density was essentially vacuum, newspapers ran apocalyptic headlines. Entrepreneurs sold comet pills and gas masks. Some people sealed their windows. Others held vigil parties, reasoning that if the world was ending, they might as well watch it together. The comet passed. Nothing happened. But the anxiety revealed something about how celestial mechanics intersects with existential terror. Medieval Europe interpreted comets through theological frameworks. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts Halley's 1066 appearance as an omen of Harold's defeat at Hastings, God writing warnings in the sky. The Great Comet of 1680 triggered prophecies across Europe, pamphlets proclaiming the end times, calls for repentance. Isaac Newton studied this same comet, calculating its orbit using his new gravitational theory. His work proved comets followed predictable paths, natural laws rather than divine messaging. But this rationalization didn't comfort everyone. If comets obeyed mechanical laws rather than divine will, what stopped them from eventually striking Earth? Newton's calculations made the sky more predictable and, in some ways, more threatening. Campbell draws on this specific anxiety, the terror of things that operate beyond human influence. Literary precedents exist. H. G. Wells' The Star, 1897, presents a rogue astronomical body approaching Earth, its arrival calculated by astronomers who watch helplessly as it approaches. Wells emphasizes the impotence of human response. Governments mobilize, populations panic, scientists calculate impact trajectories, and none of it matters. The celestial body follows its path regardless of human desire. Camille Flammarion's Omega, The Last Days of the World, 1894, similarly explores cosmic-scale destruction as natural event, comet collision as scientific inevitability rather than supernatural punishment. Even earlier, Edgar Allan Poe's The Conversation of Eros and Charmian, 1839, depicts two souls in afterlife discussing how a comet destroyed Earth by altering atmospheric composition. Poe's genius lies in making the mechanism scientific: nitrogen extraction, oxygen concentration, eventual combustion of the entire atmosphere, while maintaining apocalyptic dread. The science doesn't diminish horror. It amplifies it by removing any possibility of supernatural intervention or miraculous salvation. The Harbinger archetype transcends Western tradition. Norse mythology presents Naglfar, the ship made of dead men's nails that signals Ragnarok's beginning. Its arrival doesn't cause the end, it announces that the end has begun, that cosmic cycles have reached their terminal phase. Hindu cosmology describes Kali Yuga, the age of decline, with specific astronomical configurations marking its progression. Mesoamerican calendars track celestial cycles with apocalyptic implications, though often misunderstood by later interpreters. The pattern repeats, celestial movements as markers of inevitable transformation. Ghroth synthesizes these traditions. It combines the comet's historical role as omen with the mechanical inevitability of orbital physics. It functions as herald without requiring anyone to send it, announcement without message, warning without mercy. Campbell wasn't inventing a new fear. He was crystallizing an ancient one into modern astronomical terms, giving it a name, and placing it within a fictional mythology that treated such entities as observable phenomena rather than supernatural aberrations. The name Ghroth itself resists comfortable pronunciation. Try saying it aloud: the guttural opening, the throat-caught consonant cluster, the abrupt termination. Lovecraft pioneered this technique of phonetic alienation, names like Cthulhu and Azathoth that feel wrong in the mouth, words that human vocal apparatus seems poorly designed to produce. Campbell continues this tradition but with subtle differences. Where Lovecraft's names often suggested vast syllabic complexity, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, Campbell opts for compact brutality. Ghroth. 4 letters after the initial consonant. Nothing excessive, nothing ornate. The phonetic construction bears examination. That initial, GH, appears in English primarily in words with Anglo-Saxon or Celtic roots, ghost, ghastly, ghoul. Words associated with death and the liminal. The R that follows creates a sound requiring the tongue to shift backward in the mouth, a physiologically uncomfortable transition. Then, Oth, echoing Azathoth, establishing mythological kinship while maintaining distinct identity. The similarity isn't coincidence. Campbell's entity operates in Azathoth's cosmos, follows the same fundamental indifference, but specializes where Azathoth generalizes. Possible semantic resonances emerge when examining the name's components. The GR sound appears in words describing unwanted expansion, growth, grotesque, grotto. Underground spaces, abnormal development, things that should not increase but do. Consider grotto, which shares Ghroth's first 3 letters, a cave, a hollow, a space where something might sleep. Or growth, the process of increase, of cellular multiplication, of tumors expanding in darkness. Campbell likely didn't consciously invoke these associations, but language carries weight below the level of explicit meaning. Compare Ghroth's name to other astronomical entities in the mythos. Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of infinity, its name suggests chaos, the Azath component having no clear etymology, resisting interpretation. Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate. Its name contains Sothoth, possibly linking to Thoth, Egyptian god of knowledge, suggesting this entity's role as cosmic boundary and forbidden wisdom. Ghroth occupies different semantic territory. It announces rather than embodies, heralds rather than rules. Its name carries no suggestion of divinity or mastery, nothing implying worship or supplication would matter. The title, Harbinger, deserves equal scrutiny. In medieval usage, a harbinger was an official who rode ahead of an army or royal procession, arranging lodging and supplies. The word derives from Old French herberge, meaning shelter, but came to mean the opposite, one who announces arrival, particularly arrival that requires preparation. By extension, any sign of coming events gained this designation. Comets became harbingers. Strange weather became harbingers. The word shifted from describing a role to describing function. That which precedes and announces. But Ghroth presents an ontological problem. A harbinger implies someone or something being heralded. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse follow a herald, an angel with a trumpet announcing their release. John the Baptist proclaimed the coming of Christ. A harbinger exists in relation to what follows. Ghroth operates differently. It wakes the old ones, yes, but does it serve them? Did they create it? Does it move at their command? The texts. Campbell's fictional sources like the Revelations of Glauci suggest no such relationship. Ghroth's orbit precedes these entities' awareness. They sleep. It passes. Its passage wakes them. Cause and effect exist, but not intention, not design. This creates the unsettling possibility that growth is a harbinger without a sender, an announcement that announces itself, a herald that heralds only its own approach. The alarm clock that no one set but which rings nonetheless. Occult traditions provide additional context. Medieval astrology distinguished between planets, wanderers, and fixed stars, with comets occupying ambiguous territory, temporary, unpredictable, neither planet nor star. Hermetic philosophy emphasized, as above, so below, celestial movements reflecting or determining terrestrial events. Ghroth perverts this principle. Its movements don't reflect anything. They dictate. The cosmos above doesn't mirror the world below. It reshapes it through simple passage. The entity's song requires separate consideration. Campbell describes Ghroth emitting a call, a transmission, something detected not just audibly but existentially. This invokes the ancient concept of the music of the spheres, Pythagorean and later medieval notion that celestial bodies produce harmonic tones as they move, inaudible to human ears but fundamentally ordering reality. Ghroth's song corrupts this harmony into alarm, beauty into terror, cosmic music into wake-up call for sleeping gods. These linguistic and symbolic layers transform Ghroth from simple plot device into mythological construct, something that feels like it should have existed in human folklore all along. Campbell employs a specific technique throughout his Mythos contributions, the invented source text. Where Lovecraft created the Necronomicon and various other grimoires, Campbell generated his own bibliography of forbidden knowledge, the revelations of Ghroth, the Ponape scripture, the Garn fragments. These aren't merely names dropped for atmospheric effect. Campbell provides specific citations, quotes passages, describes physical characteristics of the volumes themselves. The Revelations of Ghroth supposedly consists of 11 volumes bound in human skin, written by those touched by the entity Ghroth, each author adding their knowledge before succumbing. Volume 9, according to Campbell's stories, contains references to Ghroth. This false archaeology serves crucial functions. First, it creates depth through implication. Readers encounter not the entity directly but references to references, scholarly discussion of ancient texts discussing older traditions. Second, it allows Campbell to control information flow. He can reveal what these texts say about Ghroth without depicting Ghroth itself. The entity remains glimpsed through textual fragments, astronomical observations recorded by previous civilizations, mythological allusions that don't quite align with each other. Third, it generates the illusion of research. Readers can't verify these texts don't exist, and Campbell writes with sufficient specificity that suspension of disbelief becomes easier than constant skepticism. Consider how Campbell presents Ghroth in The Tugging. The entity never appears on page. Instead, we get a character reading about it in old manuscripts, astronomical records that might reference it, strange tidal phenomena that could indicate its approach, testimonies from coastal residents describing sounds in the sky, historical accounts of previous disappearances. The narrative assembles evidence without providing certainty. This technique, revelation through accumulation rather than confirmation, makes Ghroth feel more real than direct description would. We're left constructing the entity from fragmentary evidence, the same way archaeologists reconstruct ancient cultures from pottery shards and foundation stones. The intertextual connectivity extends beyond Campbell's own work. Other mythos authors occasionally reference Ghroth, though far less frequently than entities like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep. Lynn Carter mentioned it briefly in his Zothic legend cycle stories. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game codified Ghroth's characteristics, giving it statistics and game mechanics, paradoxically making it both more real to players and more obviously fictional. This selective adoption matters. Ghroth never achieved the cultural penetration of Lovecraft's major creations, remaining somewhat obscure even within mythos fiction circles. This obscurity might be intentional on Campbell's part, or at least congruent with his approach. The most terrifying entities aren't necessarily the most famous. Ghroth works precisely because it hasn't been overexposed, hasn't appeared in countless stories, hasn't been reduced to tentacled icon. It remains what Campbell designed, a narrative infrastructure, the reason other horrors manifest rather than a horror directly confronted. The question of authenticity becomes particularly interesting when examining Campbell's use of real astronomical concepts. Comets do follow elliptical orbits. They do return at calculable intervals. Some objects in our solar system have orbits measured in thousands or millions of years, long enough that human civilization might rise and fall between passages. Campbell doesn't invent physics, he inserts fictional entity into legitimate astronomical framework. This anchoring in genuine science makes Ghroth's impossibility more disturbing. Everything about its behavior matches real celestial mechanics except for one detail, the song it emits and what that song accomplishes. We might compare Campbell's technique to Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, which grounds cosmic horror in real geography, the South Pacific, specific coordinates, actual islands. Readers could theoretically sail to those coordinates and find not R'lyeh, obviously, but the geographical context Lovecraft described. Campbell does similar work with astronomy. We can observe comets, calculate orbits, understand gravitational mechanics. We just can't, yet, identify which comet is Ghroth, or prove it isn't out there, following its patient ellipse through the dark. The power of Campbell's myth-building lies in what he doesn't explain. He never clarifies whether Ghroth is sentient or simply a natural phenomenon that coincidentally wakes other entities. He doesn't specify its orbital period, is it decades, centuries, millennia? He doesn't confirm what happens to worlds in its path. The vagueness isn't laziness, it's strategy. Each reader fills the gaps differently, making the entity personally terrifying rather than universally defined. Some imagine Ghroth arriving within their lifetime. Others place it safely distant. Both groups feel the same crawling unease when looking at night sky, wondering if that's a comet or something else entirely. This constructed authenticity, this sense of stumbling onto suppressed truth rather than reading obvious fiction, required specific philosophical groundwork, concepts that made Ghroth not just possible but inevitable within the Mythos framework. Lovecraft established cosmic indifferentism as horror's philosophical foundation. Humanity occupies no special position in a universe that doesn't acknowledge our existence. His entities ignore us not through malice but through fundamental incomprehension. We register to them the way bacteria register to us, not at all, or only when accidentally disturbed. Campbell accepts this premise but pushes it toward mechanism. Ghroth doesn't ignore humanity because we're insignificant. It ignores us because it's a celestial body following physical laws. You cannot be noticed by an orbit. This distinction transforms the nature of cosmic horror. Lovecraft's Cthulhu might theoretically be reasoned with, bargained with, if only we could establish communication. Cultists in The Call of Cthulhu believe they've achieved exactly this: prayers answered, dreams shared, promises made. Whether this communication is genuine or delusion doesn't matter, the possibility exists. Ghroth offers no such possibility. It's not a being that dreams. It's a thing that moves. You don't pray to gravity. You don't negotiate with momentum. The horror becomes one of helpless anticipation. Imagine knowing that in some calculable future, could be 5 years, could be 5,000, a celestial body will pass through our region of space and its passage will trigger cascading catastrophe. Not because it intends to, but because that's what happens when it passes. Campbell gives us determinism without deity, apocalypse without judgment. The universe operates according to rules, and we simply happen to be positioned where those rules produce extinction-level consequences. This connects to thermodynamic horror, the slow recognition that entropy cannot be reversed. The universe trends toward heat death not through malevolent design but through statistical mechanics. Stars burn out. Galaxies drift apart. Energy disperses. Ghroth operates similarly. Its orbit represents cosmic clockwork, and we're simply in the mechanism's path when gears turn. The entity becomes shorthand for everything that operates beyond human control or comprehension, everything that will occur regardless of our response. Consider the implications for human endeavor. If Ghroth's return is inevitable and its effects catastrophic, what meaning does civilization possess? Why build, create, preserve, plan? Campbell doesn't answer this question, but he forces readers to confront it. Some might argue that meaning exists in the doing regardless of outcome. Others might conclude that only immediate experience matters if long-term survival is impossible. The entity doesn't resolve philosophical debates, it simply makes them urgent. The scale amplifies the horror. Lovecraft's entities were vast but localized, Cthulhu in Relia, Azathoth at the center of infinity, elsewhere but theoretically avoidable. Ghroth is planetary-scale threat that treats planets as incidental. Its orbit encompasses light-years. Earth represents one point along an ellipse that includes dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of worlds. We're not targeted. We're simply present when the alarm rings. This casual inclusion in a process that spans solar systems reduces human significance beyond even Lovecraft's vision. The universe as clock metaphor deserves unpacking. Clocks serve human purposes. We built them to measure time, organize activity, create schedule. But imagine a clock that predates its builders, that runs without being wound, whose purpose no one can identify. Ghroth functions as this inhuman timepiece. Its orbital period measures something, marks intervals between events we barely comprehend. The old ones sleep and wake according to cycles we didn't establish and cannot alter. We're creatures living inside a mechanism we didn't build, watching gears turn that will eventually crush us, and the worst part is this: it's not murder. It's just how the machine works. Campbell's philosophical innovation lies in removing even the comfort of cosmic malevolence. Lovecraft's universe doesn't care about humanity, but his entities possess will, desire, intention. They act. Ghroth merely occurs, like weather, like earthquakes, like any natural disaster operating on geological timescale. We fear hurricanes despite knowing they follow meteorological laws. We fear Ghroth for the same reason, except hurricanes don't wake sleeping gods. This brings us to those gods, the entities Ghroth's passage disturbs, and the question of what relationship exists between Harbinger and Awakened. Campbell's descriptions of Ghroth vary deliberately across his fictional sources, creating confusion that feels like corrupted transmission rather than authorial inconsistency. Some texts call it a dark comet. Others suggest a rogue planet, something larger than astronomical bodies should be yet somehow undetected by modern telescopes. One passage in the Revelations of Ghroth describes it as vast beyond the measuring of worlds, while another suggests it small enough to pass between planetary orbits without gravitational disruption. These contradictions serve a purpose. They suggest that human observation fails to capture Ghroth accurately, that our instruments and conceptual frameworks can't properly register what it is. That song, or call, presents even deeper problems. Sound cannot travel through space. Basic physics, understood since the 19th century. Yet Campbell's sources consistently describe Ghroth as emitting something, a transmission that propagates across astronomical distances and penetrates planetary surfaces to reach entities sleeping in subterranean or submarine locations. Is this sound metaphor for something else? Gravitational waves, perhaps, though Campbell wrote before their detection. Electromagnetic radiation at frequencies that trigger biological or metaphysical responses. The vagueness matters. Calling it a song makes it comprehensible while acknowledging it isn't actually acoustic. We need metaphor because we lack adequate terminology for cosmic wake-up call. The physical characteristics resist definition. If Ghroth is a comet, it should display typical cometary behavior, outgassing, tail formation when approaching stars, nucleus of ice and rock. If it's a planet, it should possess planetary mass and gravitational effects. Campbell never specifies. This ambiguity allows Ghroth to function as pure harbinger function divorced from physical constraints. It's whatever it needs to be to announce what's coming. The question of sentience haunts every description. Does Ghroth know what it does? When it passes Earth, when its song reaches down to Relia where Cthulhu lies dreaming, is this intentional communication or automatic process? Campbell provides no answer, and this uncertainty generates distinct unease. We understand malevolence, we can fear it, fight it, perhaps negotiate with it. We understand natural disaster, we can prepare, adapt, engineer solutions. But something that might be aware and might not, that might be calling and might simply be resonating, occupies uncomfortable epistemological territory. The beings Ghroth awakens form a catalogue of sleeping horrors. Cthulhu represents the primary example, the great old one whose death-like sleep in Relia persists until the stars are right. Campbell suggests Ghroth's passage constitutes this stellar alignment, not through gravitational rearrangement but through the transmission it emits. Other entities mentioned in connection include Zothamik, dwelling in abyssal trenches, and Ghatanothoa, imprisoned beneath a mountain. Each sleeps because something. Geological change, ritual binding, temporal mathematics we don't understand, locked them into dormancy. Ghroth's arrival reverses these conditions. But why? What's the relationship between celestial body and imprisoned entity? Several possibilities exist, none confirmed. Perhaps the Old Ones designed Ghroth deliberately, cosmic alarm clock ensuring their eventual release. Perhaps Ghroth is itself an Old One, a being that became astronomical process, awareness spread so thin across physical form that it operates purely mechanically. Perhaps no relationship exists at all, Ghroth's transmission operates at frequencies that coincidentally disrupt whatever holds these entities in stasis, cosmic accident rather than cosmic design. The hibernation logic deserves examination. Why do entities of near-infinite power require sleep? Lovecraft suggested that when the stars are right, certain geometries of spacetime permit Old Ones to manifest physically. When stellar configurations shift, these geometries close, trapping entities between dimensions or forcing them into dormancy. Campbell appears to work within this framework but emphasizes the mechanical aspects. The Old Ones don't choose to sleep. They're locked into cycles beyond their control, prisoners of cosmic mathematics that even they must obey. Ghroth functions as the key to multiple prisons simultaneously. Its passage through our region of space trips whatever mechanism keeps these entities bound. One orbit, multiple releases. This suggests Ghroth represents something fundamental to cosmic architecture rather than random object. Perhaps it's a structural element, something the universe requires for proper function, and our misfortune is simply existing in a region where that function produces catastrophic side effects. The hierarchy remains unclear. Is Ghroth servant to the Old Ones, their tool for escaping imprisonment? Is it their peer, another entity operating on scales we barely grasp? Or is it their superior, the thing that determines when they wake and sleep according to logic they cannot influence? Campbell never establishes pecking order, and this ambiguity makes Ghroth more disturbing. We can't even determine whether to fear it as weapon, warden, or sovereign force. What we can determine is this. Ghroth has no worship. No cults gather to pray for its return. No mad prophets receive its visions. Other mythos entities inspire devotion, however twisted. Cthulhu has his deep ones, Nyarlathotep his 1,000 masks and countless servants. Ghroth operates alone, unattended, requiring nothing from humanity or any other species. This isolation suggests it doesn't need worship because it functions regardless of recognition. The astronomer represents Ghroth's ideal victim. Not the occultist poring over forbidden texts, not the cultist seeking cosmic truth, the scientist, the rationalist, the person whose entire worldview depends on natural law and predictable phenomena. Campbell understands that cosmic horror hits hardest when it corrupts the tools we use for understanding. An astronomer discovers something in telescope observations, an anomaly in orbital calculations, a celestial body that shouldn't exist according to current models. The initial response is professional: verify data, check equipment, consult colleagues. But the anomaly persists. The object appears in multiple observations. Its trajectory can be calculated, which means it's real, which means physics accommodates it, which means everything that follows is inevitable. This progression from skepticism to horrified certainty defines Ghroth as unique madness mechanics. Other mythos entities drive people mad through revelation. Seeing Cthulhu, reading the Necronomicon, encountering truths that shatter anthropocentric worldview. Ghroth drives people mad through calculation. You work out its orbital period. You determine when it last passed. You realize what historical events coincide with previous passages, civilizational collapses, mass extinctions, geological upheavals that no one connected because the interval was too long for cultural memory to preserve. And then you calculate when it returns. The specific trauma of countdown knowledge cannot be overstated. Imagine knowing the exact year, possibly the exact month, when apocalypse arrives. Not vague prophecy about tribulation and judgment. Precise astronomical data indicating when a celestial body will enter our region of space and trigger cascading disaster. You can mark it on calendar. You can count days. Every sunrise represents one fewer before the event. This transforms time itself into weapon. Each moment becomes reminder of approach, each day a step closer to calculated ending. Campbell's stories hint at survivors of previous passages, though their testimonies remain fragmentary and questionable. Ancient texts describe the wandering star that brought madness and transformation. Coastal cultures preserve myths about sounds from the sky that preceded floods and migrations. Archaeological evidence suggests sudden abandonment of cities at irregular intervals spanning thousands of years. If Ghroth has passed before, and Campbell strongly implies it has, then its effects are written into human history, encrypted in mythologies we interpret as metaphor because the alternative is accepting that extinction-level events operate on predictable schedule. The madness Ghroth induces differs from standard Lovecraftian insanity. Lovecraft's characters go mad from comprehending humanity's cosmic insignificance, from seeing entities so vast and alien that human categories of thought collapse. Ghroth's victims go mad from comprehending their helplessness before mechanistic universe. They retain sanity enough to understand what's happening, that's the problem. Full comprehension without ability to prevent or escape. The astronomical data is correct. The calculations are sound. The conclusion is inescapable. And nothing in human knowledge or capability offers protection. Some attempt denial despite evidence. They attack their own methodology, seeking flaws in data that would invalidate conclusions. They propose alternative explanations, equipment malfunction, mass hallucination, elaborate hoax. But the evidence accumulates from independent sources. Other astronomers verify the observations. Historical records align with predicted intervals. The denial becomes its own form of madness, desperate rejection of what mathematics proves true. Others attempt preparation, which may be worse. What do you prepare for when the threat operates on planetary scale? Bunkers won't help if Ghroth's song penetrates Earth and ocean to reach sleeping entities. Evacuation is meaningless when the entire planet falls within effect radius. Religious frameworks offer no comfort, this isn't divine judgment that prayer might avert. It's orbital mechanics. You might as well pray that gravity reverse or time run backward. The paradox Campbell never resolves: if Ghroth's previous passages should have ended civilization, why does civilization persist? Several explanations exist, none satisfying. Perhaps the intervals are longer than written history, long enough that each human culture believes itself the first, unaware of predecessor civilizations that rose and fell between Ghroth's visits. Perhaps the effects vary. Sometimes Ghroth wakes entities that destroy everything, sometimes it merely wakes them and they eventually return to sleep, allowing survivors to rebuild. Perhaps Earth has simply been lucky, positioned where Ghroth's passage produces minimal effect, while other worlds along its orbit suffer complete annihilation. This last possibility is particularly disturbing. It suggests we might face fuller catastrophe next time, that previous passages were warnings we couldn't interpret because we survived them. The entities Ghroth wakes might be stirring more deeply now, or Earth's position relative to Ghroth's trajectory might be shifting in ways that increase exposure. We don't know. The people who calculate these variables go mad or fall silent. The futility of resistance shapes every human response, creating horror that no ritual or weapon can address. What makes knowledge about Ghroth dangerous isn't the information itself but its implications. Learning Cthulhu's name can supposedly draw its attention, the act of knowing creates connection. Ghroth operates differently. Knowing about Ghroth changes nothing about Ghroth. It only changes the knower. You cannot unknow an orbital period once calculated. You cannot forget the date of predicted approach. The information persists, and with it, the crushing awareness that mathematical certainty offers no protection, only foreknowledge of inevitable disaster. The Revelations of Ghroth supposedly contains extensive material about Ghroth across multiple volumes. Volume 9 describes its appearance and trajectory. Volume 11, according to Campbell's fiction, includes testimony from those who witnessed previous passages and survived, though survived may be a generous term for what remained of them. The text presents a recursive problem. Reading about Ghroth provides information necessary to recognize its approach. But this recognition serves no protective function. You gain ability to identify the harbinger without gaining ability to prevent what it heralds. Knowledge becomes burden rather than advantage. Consider the specific passages Campbell attributes to these fictional grimoires. One describes Ghroth as that which sounds the note of awakening, whose passage marks the ending of the cycle and the beginning of the ending. Another states that those who hear its song are not driven mad by sound alone but by the certainty of what sound announces. The texts warn without offering salvation, describe without explaining prevention. They function as documentation of inevitable process rather than grimoire for averting catastrophe. The danger intensifies when knowledge spreads. One person knowing about Ghroth remains isolated problem, their madness, their dread, their calculations. But what happens when astronomical data becomes public? When multiple researchers independently verify unusual celestial body following predictable orbit? When calculation of its trajectory and next approach date achieves scientific consensus? Does widespread knowledge somehow prepare entities for awakening? Does collective awareness create psychic resonance that makes Ghroth's effects more potent? Campbell never confirms these metaphysical possibilities, but he raises them through implication. Characters in his stories worry that discussing Ghroth might hasten its influence, that naming it creates vulnerability. This mirrors medieval magical thinking, speaking demons' name grants it power. But transplanted into framework where names are simply identifiers and power operates through physical mechanism. The contradiction cannot be resolved, which is precisely what makes it unsettling. Mathematical models present particular epistemological hazard. An orbit can be calculated from positional data across time. You observe celestial body at multiple points, plot its trajectory, extrapolate future position. Standard astronomy, performed thousands of times for asteroids, comets, distant planets. But what if calculation itself constitutes form of contact? What if modeling Ghroth's path in equations creates representational link that draws attention, makes Earth more visible to whatever awareness might exist within or behind the entity? This veers toward magical thinking, but Campbell's genius lies in never definitively separating natural and supernatural categories. The texts themselves may be contagion vectors. Not because they contain spells or rituals, but because they contain ideas that reshape perception. Once you've read about celestial harbinger that wakes sleeping gods, you cannot observe night sky the same way. Every comet becomes potential Ghroth. Every astronomical anomaly becomes possible evidence. The knowledge colonizes consciousness, transforming neutral observations into sources of dread. You've been infected by information that cannot be extracted or neutralized. This represents epistemic collapse, the breakdown between knowledge as power and knowledge as poison. Enlightenment philosophy promised that understanding natural world would liberate humanity from superstition and fear. Francis Bacon declared knowledge itself to be power. The scientific revolution proceeded from assumption that comprehending how universe works provides tools for shaping outcome. Ghroth inverts this promise. Understanding its mechanics, calculating its orbit, recognizing its approach, all this knowledge changes nothing except the knower's psychological state. You gain certainty without control, prediction without prevention. The category crisis matters enormously. Is Ghroth astronomical phenomenon or mythological entity? The question should have clear answer, one or the other, not both. But Campbell deliberately blurs this boundary. Ghroth exhibits properties of natural celestial body, gravitational effects, orbital mechanics, physical trajectory through space. It simultaneously exhibits properties of supernatural entity, that a song that shouldn't exist, the power to wake imprisoned gods, the presence in ancient texts alongside creatures that violate physics. When physics textbooks and necromantic grimoires describe the same thing, categories that organize understanding disintegrate. This breakdown explains why Ghroth generates such specific dread despite Campbell's minimal descriptions. The entity exists at intersection of scientific certainty and mythological terror, where calculation meets prophecy, where astronomy becomes eschatology. You cannot rationalize it away, the data is sound. You cannot dismiss it as superstition, the math is correct. Trapped between frameworks that should be mutually exclusive, the mind produces the only response available. Recognition that the universe operates according to rules more comprehensive and more horrifying than either science or magic alone suggests. The Tugging appeared in 1976 within the anthology The Height of the Scream, Campbell's collection showcasing his evolved approach to cosmic horror. The story marks Ghroth's debut, though the entity appears more through inference than direct description. Campbell had spent the previous decade establishing his Severn Valley mythology. A British counterpart to Lovecraft's Arkham, but The Tugging gestures beyond regional horror toward planetary threat. The narrative concerns a researcher investigating disappearances along the British coast, uncovering testimonies about sounds from the sky, unusual tidal behavior, and references in ancient texts to the wandering star that calls. Campbell structures the story as archaeological investigation, layering evidence from multiple sources. Historical documents, interview transcripts, astronomical observations, passages from the fictional revelations of Ghroth. This technique, accumulation of fragmentary evidence rather than singular revelation, became Campbell's signature approach. The protagonist never confronts Ghroth directly. Instead, they piece together patterns suggesting something immense passed near Earth in recent months, something that disturbed both ocean and those dwelling beneath it. The story ends ambiguously, with the researcher either dead, mad, or simply vanished, leaving their notes as sole testimony. The revelations of Ghroth serves as Campbell's primary vehicle for introducing mythos entities, Ghroth included. This fictional text supposedly consists of 11 volumes created by individuals touched by the entity Ghroth, a being dwelling in a lake near Brichester. Each volume adds knowledge from a different author before they succumb to Ghroth's influence. Campbell provides specific citations throughout his stories. Volume 9 describes the wandering Harbinger, that dark star whose passage marks intervals humanity cannot measure. These citations create illusion of comprehensive source material while allowing Campbell to reveal only selected fragments. The intertextual approach extends beyond Campbell's own work, though Ghroth never achieved the widespread adoption of entities like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep. Brian Lumley referenced it briefly in his Titus Crow series, treating Ghroth as established mythos fact without extensive elaboration. Lynn Carter included Ghroth in his Zothic legend cycle materials, positioning it within genealogies of cosmic entities but adding little narrative detail. The entity remained largely Campbell's creation, adopted by few other authors, which paradoxically enhanced its mystique. Overexposure dilutes horror. Cthulhu has appeared in so many contexts that the initial dread Campbell and Lovecraft cultivated becomes difficult to sustain. Ghroth, appearing rarely, retains its power through scarcity. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, codified Ghroth's characteristics for gameplay purposes. The game provides statistics, size category, supernatural abilities, combat values, sanity loss for encountering it. This codification serves dual purposes. For players, it makes Ghroth manageable, something that can be incorporated into scenarios and potentially defeated through clever play. For the broader mythos, it establishes pseudo-canonical details, Ghroth's approximate size, its method of attack, its relationship to other entities. Sandy Peterson and other game designers drew from Campbell's sparse descriptions and filled gaps with their own inventions, which then influenced how subsequent authors and fans understood the entity. This creates interesting feedback loop. Campbell invented Ghroth with deliberate vagueness, maintaining mystery through minimal description. Game designers required specifics for mechanical implementation. Their additions, whether Ghroth could be targeted by spells, what weapons might affect it, whether it had vulnerable points, became part of community understanding despite originating from practical game design rather than Campbell's literary vision. Later authors sometimes referenced these game-established details, treating them as authentic mythos material. The entity evolved through collaborative process Campbell never fully controlled. The sparse adoption reveals something about Ghroth's nature within mythos hierarchy. Entities that generate cults, allow for dramatic confrontations, or provide clear narrative hooks appear frequently across different authors' works. Cthulhu offers all these. Worship groups, potential awakening as plot climax, visceral tentacled presence. Nyarlathotep provides versatility through its 1,000 masks and forms. Ghroth offers none of this. It's a harbinger, announcement rather than event. You cannot dramatically battle an orbit. You cannot join cult that worships orbital mechanics. This makes Ghroth difficult to deploy narratively, which may explain its marginal status despite conceptual power. Yet this marginality serves Campbell's purpose, keeping Ghroth functioning as he intended, not as another monster to defeat but as cosmic inevitability that horror fiction can only acknowledge, never resolve. The narrative opens with academic framing, a researcher named Hodgson examining records of coastal disappearances near Severn Ford. Campbell establishes mundane context before introducing strangeness: fishing boats found empty, their crews vanished. Coastal residents reporting sounds during specific nights. Tidal anomalies that oceanographers cannot explain through lunar cycles or weather patterns. The investigation proceeds methodically, Hodgson collecting testimonies and cross-referencing them with historical records. This slow accumulation creates unease through pattern recognition rather than sudden shock. Campbell's genius lies in what he withholds. Ghroth never appears as visual presence. No tentacles breach the surface. No vast shape blocks out stars. Instead, we get descriptions of effects: water behaving incorrectly, pulling against natural tide, sounds described as singing or calling that seem to emanate from sky yet reverberate through ground, residents along the coast experiencing shared dreams of something immense passing overhead. The horror operates entirely through implication and consequence. Something was near Earth. Its proximity disturbed natural order. Then it continued its journey, leaving chaos in its wake. The story's central document is a passage from the Revelations of Ghroth that Hodgson discovers in a private collection. Campbell writes, "That which passes in the void beyond knowing, that which sounds across gulfs no telescope can measure, when its orbit brings it near, the sleepers beneath stir in their confinement. The ocean remembers, though men forget. The ocean pulls toward what calls from the dark between stars." This passage never names Ghroth explicitly, maintaining ambiguity while providing just enough specificity to suggest something astronomical and cyclical. Witness testimonies form the story's emotional core. An elderly fisherman describes 3 nights when the sea pulled wrong, as if something overhead exerted gravitational force independent of moon's influence. An amateur astronomer reports observing a dark mass that briefly occluded stars, moving with velocity that shouldn't be possible for any known celestial body. A village priest mentions parishioners reporting dreams of the wandering star, and asks Hodgson if this phrase means anything, if perhaps old legends contain truth after all. Each testimony adds piece to mosaic without completing picture. Campbell employs coastal setting as liminal space where terrestrial meets cosmic. The shore represents boundary, solid earth ending, unknown ocean beginning. When Hodgson witnesses the tugging himself, standing on beach at night, Campbell describes sensation rather than sight. The water moved against its nature, drawn upward as though the sky itself exerted pull stronger than Earth's gravity. He felt it in his bones, a wrongness in the weight of things, as if the planet trembled at the passing of something vast enough to disturb its rotation. This internal, somatic horror proves more effective than any physical description could be. The ending refuses resolution. Hodgson's notes break off mid-sentence. His landlady reports he left suddenly one night, heading toward the coast, and never returned. Local police find no body, no evidence of foul play, just abandoned research materials and that incomplete final entry. The calculations suggest it will return in. The dash implies interruption, but whether by madness, death, or something worse remains unclear. Campbell provides no closure because Ghroth's narrative doesn't permit closure. It passed. It will pass again. Human response is ultimately irrelevant to that cycle. The atmospheric technique throughout relies on sensory wrongness rather than visual horror. The ocean's sound changes, described as deeper or pulling, in ways that shouldn't apply to water. The night sky feels different to characters, though they cannot articulate how, stars positioned correctly yet seeming wrong in configuration. Even time feels distorted during the nights of strongest effect, with witnesses reporting hours passing like minutes or vice versa. Campbell understands that cosmic horror works best when it perverts familiar sensory experience rather than introducing entirely alien stimuli. Character psychology follows predictable but inevitable trajectory. Hodgson begins as skeptic, seeking rational explanations for disappearances. The accumulation of evidence erodes skepticism gradually. He doesn't experience single revelation that shatters worldview. Instead, he undergoes slow process of accepting that natural laws are more complex and more threatening than education suggested. His final notes show someone who has calculated something terrible, performed mathematics that lead to conclusion he cannot accept yet cannot refute. The madness, if that's what it is, comes not from seeing something incomprehensible but from comprehending something unbearable. The story functions as warning Campbell never makes explicit. Some investigations should not be pursued, not because the truth is hidden but because it's available to anyone willing to look carefully at the evidence. Ghroth is calculable. Its orbit can be determined. And knowing when it returns offers no advantage except the psychological torture of anticipation. Campbell's The Plane of Sound predates Ghroth's explicit introduction by over a decade but establishes conceptual groundwork for astronomical horror based on transmission rather than presence. Published in 1964, the story concerns a region where sound behaves impossibly, accumulating across time until concentrated into overwhelming cacophony. While The Plane of Sound focuses on terrestrial phenomenon, it introduces Campbell's fascination with cosmic vibration as horror mechanism. The idea that certain frequencies or transmissions carry effects beyond mere auditory stimulus. Ghroth's song evolves directly from this earlier exploration, transplanting the concept from geographic anomaly to celestial source. The progression matters because it reveals Campbell's methodology. He doesn't introduce fully formed cosmic entities. He experiments with horror concepts in localized contexts, strange sounds, disturbing frequencies, transmissions that affect consciousness, then scales them upward to astronomical scope. By the time The Tugging appeared in 1976, Campbell had spent years refining how vibration and sound could generate existential dread. Ghroth represents culmination of this development. A source so vast and distant that its song crosses interplanetary space, so fundamental that it wakes entities humanity hoped would sleep forever. Lynn Carter's The Fissures from Outside, 1976, and related Zothic cycle stories reference Ghroth within broader genealogies of cosmic entities. Carter, working to systematize Mythos cosmology, positioned Ghroth as offspring or creation of Xaxacluth, placing it within family trees of Old Ones and Outer Gods. This impulse toward categorization runs counter to Campbell's intentional ambiguity. Where Campbell leaves Ghroth's origins mysterious, Carter provides lineage. Where Campbell maintains uncertainty about whether Ghroth is sentient or mechanical, Carter treats it as deliberate creation serving specific purpose within cosmic hierarchy. The contrast illuminates different approaches to mythos expansion. Carter sought comprehensive mythology, a complete cosmology explaining how various entities related to each other, who created whom, what cosmic wars occurred in prehistory. This produces rich material for world building but potentially diminishes individual entities' mystery. Campbell's approach maintains gaps and contradictions, refusing to systematize, which keeps each entity disturbing through ambiguity. Ghroth works better as unexplained harbinger than as documented offspring of some greater entity. The moment you provide its origin story, you reduce its power. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series mentions Ghroth tangentially, treating it as established fact within the character's encounters with various cosmic forces. Lumley's protagonist, a occult investigator with extensive mythos knowledge, references Ghroth in internal monologue when observing astronomical phenomena, not Ghroth, surely. The Harbinger's return wasn't due for centuries according to calculations in the Ponape scripture. This casual reference suggests Ghroth occupies known position within mythos astronomy, something experts track like we track Halley's Comet. Lumley's integration acknowledges Campbell's creation while stripping it of mystery through familiarity. This reveals tension inherent in shared universe storytelling. Each author's edition must be accessible to other authors, which requires some level of codification and explanation. But cosmic horror depends on the unknown, the uncertain, the incomprehensible. The more concrete Ghroth becomes across multiple authors' works, its size defined, its orbit calculated, its effects catalogued, the less horrifying it becomes. The entity transforms from source of dread into piece of fictional astronomy, interesting but not unsettling. Campbell's own later works reference Ghroth sparingly, maintaining its status as rare event rather than frequent threat. The Moon Lens, 1980, mentions ancient observations of the wandering star in context of prehistoric civilizations that may have witnessed its passage. The Franklin Paragraphs, 1973, includes a character researching astronomical anomalies who discovers references to cyclical catastrophes possibly linked to celestial harbinger, though Ghroth isn't named explicitly. Campbell treats the entity as background element of his cosmos rather than protagonist, a condition that must be acknowledged but rarely confronted directly. This restraint distinguishes Campbell from authors who overuse their creations. Lovecraft himself fell into pattern of repeatedly invoking Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, and other entities until they became familiar rather than alien. Campbell learned from this, keeping Ghroth marginal within his own fiction. The entity appears in perhaps 3 or 4 stories directly, with oblique references in several others. This scarcity preserves its impact, each appearance feels significant because appearances are rare. The influence on later cosmic horror extends beyond direct references. Peter Watt's novel, Blind Sight, 2006, features an approaching object that fundamentally changes humanity's understanding of consciousness and intelligence, though Watts works in hard science fiction rather than supernatural horror. Cixin Liu's Three-Body Problem, 2008, presents the dark forest theory, civilizations hiding from each other because detection means destruction, cosmic horror operating through physics and game theory. Both authors create dread from astronomical scale and inevitability without invoking Ghroth specifically, yet Campbell's work established template, threats that operate beyond human scale, that follow inexorable patterns, that cannot be negotiated with or escaped. These literary descendants demonstrate Ghroth's conceptual legacy even when the entity itself remains obscure. The idea of cosmic harbinger announcing calculated doom has migrated beyond Campbell's specific creation into broader horror and science fiction consciousness, influencing how authors approach astronomical terror and the intersection of physics with existential dread. August Derleth's systematic avoidance of Ghroth reveals fundamental incompatibility between his approach and Campbell's philosophy. Derleth spent decades organizing Lovecraft's chaotic mythology into coherent framework. Elder Gods versus Great Old Ones, Elemental Classifications, Good versus Evil Cosmology. This structure required entities to fit categories. Cthulhu became Water Elemental, Nyarlathotep Earth Elemental Servant, and so forth. Ghroth resists this taxonomy completely. It's neither water nor earth nor air nor fire. It doesn't serve elder gods or oppose them. It simply exists and moves, a mechanical process that cannot be categorized within Derleth's dualistic system. Derleth's published works through the 1960s and early 1970s make no reference to Campbell's astronomical Harbinger, despite Derleth's role as Arkham House publisher giving him access to Campbell's emerging mythology. This silence speaks volumes. Derleth couldn't incorporate Ghroth without undermining the organizational principles he'd imposed on the mythos. An entity that wakes the old ones through orbital mechanics rather than deliberate malevolence, that follows physical laws rather than choosing sides in cosmic conflict, that might not even be sentient, this breaks Derleth's careful systematization. So Derleth simply ignored it, treating Campbell's Severn Valley mythology as peripheral to true Lovecraft cosmology. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, conversely, embraced Ghroth precisely because games require concrete details. The 1983 supplement, The Asylum and Other Tales, provided the first comprehensive game statistics. Ghroth classified as Outer God rather than Great Old One, given impossibly high attributes reflecting its planetary scale, assigned the special ability to awaken Great Old Ones within light years of its passage. Game designer Sandy Peterson, working from Campbell's sparse descriptions, made practical choices about how Ghroth would function mechanically. These choices became influential beyond gaming circles. Peterson established that Ghroth measures approximately 2,000 miles in diameter, small for a planet, enormous for a comet. He specified that its song operates as psychic transmission affecting sentient beings within range, causing madness in humans while stirring imprisoned entities. He created game mechanics for investigators potentially preventing Ghroth's effects, which fundamentally contradicts Campbell's vision of inevitable astronomical event but provides necessary player agency for interactive medium. You cannot build satisfying game scenario around completely unstoppable threat. Later game supplements expanded these details. Malleus Monstrorum, 2006. Provided extensive write-up including historical sightings, orbital period estimates, ranging from centuries to millennia depending on trajectory calculations, and specific entities associated with Ghroth's passages. The game materials referenced ancient civilizations that supposedly tracked the Harbinger and attempted preparations, all failing ultimately but leaving records that modern investigators might discover. This creates rich gaming material while moving progressively further from Campbell's original conception of unexplained celestial mechanism. The feedback loop affected how fans and later authors understood Ghroth. When someone researches the entity online, they frequently encounter game statistics before Campbell's original stories. The RPG's concrete details, specific size, defined abilities, cataloged effects, become de facto canon despite originating from game design necessity rather than Campbell's literary intent. This demonstrates how shared universe material evolves through multiple iterations, each adding specificity until the original ambiguity becomes buried under accumulated detail. Modern literary resurrections remain rare but occasionally powerful. Laird Barron's cosmic horror fiction, particularly stories like The Croning, 2012, and Swift to Chase, 2016. Features astronomical horrors that echo Ghroth's conceptual approach without directly referencing it. Barron presents celestial entities operating on geological timescales, human civilization merely incidental to their movements, awareness that extinction might operate on schedule. The philosophical alignment with Campbell's work is clear even when specific entities differ. The anthology, Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, 1990s editions, included Campbell's The Tugging, introducing Ghroth to readers who might encounter Lovecraft first and explore derivative works second. This positioning within foundational mythos collections grants Ghroth semi-canonical status, not Lovecraft's own creation, but significant enough for inclusion in definitive anthologies. Yet even here, Ghroth remains one entity among dozens, never achieving the prominence of Cthulhu, Hastur, or other frequently deployed horrors. Artistic interpretations face particular challenges. Visual artists attempting to depict Ghroth must reconcile contradictory descriptions. Is it comet with tail, dark sphere, something else entirely? Most artwork defaults to massive dark planet aesthetic, sometimes adding organic textures or strange protrusions to suggest it's not purely astronomical. The black metal band Dark Space used Ghroth imagery for album artwork, depicting it as void black sphere trailing nebulous distortion, which captures the entity's essential wrongness better than more detailed illustrations might. Musical projects in dark ambient and doom metal genres have adopted Ghroth as conceptual anchor. The idea of cosmic song, of transmission that crosses space and wakes sleeping gods, translates naturally to sonic experimentation. Bands create pieces intended as representations of Ghroth's song, low-frequency drones, dissonant harmonics, sounds designed to produce unease. Whether these capture Campbell's vision or not, they demonstrate the entity's migration from literature into other artistic media, each medium interpreting the Harbinger through its particular capabilities and constraints. The collaborative expansions ultimately reveal both the strength and fragility of Campbell's creation. Strong enough conceptually that other authors and artists find it compelling decades after introduction. Fragile enough that each interpretation risks diminishing the original's power through excessive specificity or misunderstanding of core philosophy. Ghroth works best when described minimally, suggested rather than defined, acknowledged rather than confronted. Every edition risks reducing mystery, yet the entity continues attracting attention precisely because the mystery remains, despite accumulated elaborations, somehow intact. Comet panic recurs with predictable regularity throughout human history, which makes Ghroth's fictional framework disturbingly easy to map onto actual astronomical anxiety. The Hale-Bopp comet's 1997 approach triggered the Heaven's Gate cult suicide. 39 people convinced that a spacecraft hiding behind the comet would transport their souls to higher existence. Their mistake wasn't believing something followed the comet. Their mistake was thinking it offered salvation rather than announcing something far worse. This pattern of celestial hope corrupted into celestial dread provides ready template for Ghroth mythology to colonize. The Planet X, or Nibiru, conspiracy demonstrates how easily astronomical speculation becomes apocalyptic prophecy. Beginning in 1995, various writers claimed a massive planet on long elliptical orbit would eventually collide with or pass dangerously close to Earth. Proponents cited ancient Sumerian texts, NASA cover-ups, unusual gravitational anomalies in outer solar system. The predicted dates for Nibiru's arrival shifted repeatedly, 2003, then 2012, then other calculations. But the core narrative persisted: something large is coming, authorities know but won't tell us, its approach will trigger catastrophe. Replace Nibiru with Ghroth, and the conspiracy theory becomes cosmic horror with minimal alteration. The 2012 apocalypse phenomenon, tied to supposed Mayan calendar predictions, generated similar patterns. Despite Mayan scholars explaining that the calendar simply completed a cycle rather than predicting ending, millions believed something significant would occur on December 21, 2012. Some expected spiritual transformation. Others prepared for disasters. The date passed uneventfully, but the psychological mechanisms that generated such widespread belief remain active. When people want to believe in scheduled apocalypse, when they need framework for understanding ambient dread, they find or create celestial harbingers to explain their anxiety. Internet folklore has generated limited but persistent Ghroth-related content. The SCP Foundation, collaborative fiction project cataloging anomalous objects and entities, includes entries for astronomical horrors clearly influenced by Campbell's work, though typically not naming Ghroth directly. SCP-2399, for instance, describes a massive object in Jupiter's orbit emitting signals that cause psychological distress when decoded. The pattern echoes Ghroth: celestial body, strange transmission, effects on consciousness, inevitability of approach. These derivative creations demonstrate how Campbell's concept propagates through modern horror communities even when his specific entity remains relatively obscure. Amateur astronomy forums occasionally feature posts asking about dark comets or objects that seem to move against expected trajectories. Most prove to be observation errors, equipment problems, or misidentification of known celestial bodies. But some posts acquire suspicious specificity. Coordinates that don't correspond to catalogued objects, calculations of orbital periods that suggest previous passages at historically significant dates, references to sounds or dreams associated with particular observation nights. Whether these represent genuine confusion, elaborate hoaxes, or something else entirely becomes impossible to determine. The Internet permits sustained ambiguity in ways that pre-digital hoaxes couldn't maintain. The psychological appeal of checkable predictions explains some of Ghroth's resonance. Unlike vague prophecies about tribulation or judgment, an astronomical entity with calculable orbit provides concrete timeline. This makes it paradoxically more believable. You can theoretically verify or falsify claims about when it will return, what its previous passages coincided with, whether evidence exists in geological or archaeological records. Of course, when people perform these calculations, they invariably find what they're looking for. Historical catastrophes align with predicted intervals if you're willing to adjust the intervals slightly. Mass extinctions can be spaced to match almost any orbital period you propose. The math becomes self-fulfilling through selective attention to confirming evidence. When fiction bleeds into paranoia, the boundary becomes difficult to identify from inside the experience. Someone reads about Ghroth, finds the concept compelling, begins researching actual astronomical data to see if anything matches. They discover anomalies. There are always anomalies in complex systems like orbital mechanics. They calculate patterns in historical disasters. They convince themselves that Campbell wrote fiction around kernel of truth, that Ghroth exists but authorities suppress evidence. From outside, this looks like obsession or delusion. From inside, it feels like investigation, like uncovering what others refuse to acknowledge. The entity's sparse literary presence actually enhances this dynamic. If everyone knew about Ghroth, it couldn't be the suppressed truth the paranoid researcher believes they've discovered. This brings us to how Ghroth has manifested across actual media, where its influence appears more often in tone and concept than direct adaptation. Ghroth has never appeared in major film or television production, which isn't surprising given the fundamental challenge of filming an astronomical event as horror. Cinema excels at visceral threat, tentacles emerging from shadows, creatures pursuing victims, physical danger made visible. An orbiting celestial body that drives people mad through its mere passage resists cinematic translation. You cannot film inevitability. You cannot show dread accumulating across years of anticipation. Hollywood's few attempts at cosmic horror typically default to making the cosmic entities fight able, which contradicts everything Ghroth represents. Lars von Trier's Melancholia, 2011, comes closest to capturing Ghroth's essential horror without referencing Campbell's work at all. The film depicts a rogue planet on collision course with Earth, characters watching its approach grow larger in the sky each night, knowing exactly when impact will occur. The astronomical mechanics are handled seriously, no last-minute salvation, no scientific miracle, no escape possible. The planet arrives on schedule and annihilates everything. Von Trier's interest lies in psychological response to calculated doom, how different personalities process certainty of extinction. This mirrors Campbell's concerns perfectly, even though Melancholia operates in realistic rather than cosmic horror framework. Don McKellar's Last Night, 1998, explores similar territory, characters spending final hours before unspecified apocalypse, knowing when it will occur but not what precisely will happen. The film treats scheduled ending as given, examining how people choose to occupy time before cessation. Again, the connection to Ghroth remains conceptual rather than direct. But these films demonstrate that Campbell's central idea, the horror of calculated apocalypse, can translate to visual media when filmmakers resist the urge to make catastrophe preventable. Gaming implementations face different challenges. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game included Ghroth in various supplements from 1983 onward, forcing designers to solve an inherent problem: how do you make an unstoppable cosmic event into playable scenario? The solutions typically involve investigators trying to prevent specific consequences of Ghroth's passage rather than preventing the passage itself. A scenario might task players with keeping a particular Great Old One from fully waking, performing rituals that maintain partial binding despite Ghroth's song, evacuating areas before entities emerge. This preserves player agency while acknowledging they cannot alter the fundamental event. The board game Eldritch Horror, 2013, features Ghroth as one of several ancient ones players must defeat before it awakens. Which in gameplay terms means accumulating enough Doom tokens to trigger loss condition. This completely inverts Campbell's concept. Players gather clues, close gates, fight monsters, all to prevent Ghroth's effects from manifesting. The game makes cosmic inevitability into challengeable threat because games require possibility of victory. Without that possibility, you're not playing a game, you're participating in predetermined loss, which most people don't find entertaining. Sunless Skies, 2019, a video game set in Victorian space exploration setting, includes astronomical horrors clearly influenced by Campbell's work. While Ghroth doesn't appear by name, the game features celestial bodies that emit dangerous influences, stars that produce madness through observation, and the recurring theme of space as vast hostile environment operating according to rules that preclude human survival. The game's hours, entities existing outside normal time, function similarly to Ghroth, vast presences that human characters encounter only as side effects of their existence, never as direct confrontations. Musical interpretations prove more successful at capturing Ghroth's essence. Black metal projects like Darkspace create albums depicting interstellar horror, using extreme distortion and atmospheric drones to suggest cosmic vastness. Their track, Dark 3. 11" extends for over 20 minutes, building layers of dissonant sound that evoke something immense and incomprehensible moving through void. Whether intended as Ghroth specifically, the sonic approach matches Campbell's concept, horror from scale and inevitability rather than sudden shock. Dark ambient artists have explored the Song of Ghroth as compositional challenge. How do you create sound that suggests cosmic transmission? Projects like Atrium Carceri and Lustmord use extremely low frequencies, sounds felt as much as heard, combined with metallic resonances and what's termed sacred noise, frequencies that produce unease through acoustic properties rather than musical structure. These compositions attempt to create what Campbell described, a call that crosses space, reaches consciousness at levels below rational thought, and announces something humanity should fear but cannot prevent. Doom metal bands embrace Ghroth's apocalyptic implications. Groups like Mournful Congregation and Esoteric create compositions structured around slow, inevitable progression, riffs that build across 10-minute tracks toward crushing resolution. The musical form mirrors narrative form, you know where the composition is heading, you can hear it building, and this foreknowledge doesn't diminish impact, it intensifies it. The countdown becomes part of the horror. These adaptations across media demonstrate Ghroth's conceptual portability even when direct references remain rare. The core idea, celestial harbinger announcing calculated doom, translates to any medium capable of building tension and denying resolution. Film struggles because cinema typically demands visual climax. Games struggle because they require player agency. But music, particularly genres designed to produce unease, can capture what Campbell achieved literarily. The dread of approach, the certainty of arrival, the impossibility of prevention. Academic analysis of cosmic horror has expanded significantly since the 1990s, though Ghroth remains peripheral even within this specialized discourse. Scholars examining Lovecraft's philosophical pessimism typically focus on his major entities and better-known works. Campbell's contributions receive attention primarily in studies of British horror literature or examinations of mythos expansion beyond Lovecraft himself. China Miéville's academic work on weird fiction acknowledges Campbell's astronomical horror but treats Ghroth as minor example rather than central case study. The entity's obscurity proves paradoxically appropriate. Academic tendency toward comprehensive coverage conflicts with Ghroth's power through scarcity. Thomas Ligotti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, provides philosophical framework that illuminates Ghroth without mentioning it specifically. Ligotti argues that consciousness itself constitutes horror, that awareness of our cosmic insignificance and inevitable extinction produces existential dread no amount of rationalization can eliminate. Ghroth embodies this philosophy perfectly. An entity whose existence reminds us that our annihilation operates on schedule, that the universe contains mechanisms of destruction we can calculate but not prevent, that consciousness allows us to know we're doomed without providing means to alter that doom. Ligotti would likely appreciate Campbell's Harbinger as pure expression of cosmic pessimism. Horror fan communities online demonstrate interesting patterns in how they discuss Ghroth. Reddit's r/Lovecraft subreddit features periodic threads asking about lesser-known entities, or underrated mythos creatures, and Ghroth appears regularly in these contexts. Commenters appreciate its conceptual elegance, the astronomical horror angle, the inevitability, the contrast with more commonly deployed tentacled gods. But this appreciation remains largely theoretical. Few users report Ghroth as their favorite entity or the one they find most terrifying. The entity generates intellectual respect more than visceral dread, perhaps because its horror requires contemplation rather than immediate emotional response. Power scaling debates reveal how fandom culture struggles with entities like Ghroth. Online communities devoted to comparing fictional characters' relative strength, who would win in fight between X and Y, find Ghroth nearly impossible to position. Is it more powerful than Cthulhu because it wakes Cthulhu? Or less powerful because it's possibly non-sentient mechanism rather than deliberate actor? Does size equal power when discussing cosmic entities? These debates miss the point entirely, trying to apply combat logic to something that doesn't fight, but they reveal how modern fan culture processes mythos material through frameworks Campbell never intended. The expanded mythos problem creates ongoing tension. Lovecraft's original stories constitute core canon. Derleth's editions occupy disputed territory. Some fans accept them, others reject Derleth's systematization as fundamental misunderstanding. Campbell's Severn Valley material generally receives acceptance as valid expansion. But what about role-playing game editions? Fan fiction that becomes widely circulated? At what point does collaborative mythology become too collaborative, too diluted? Ghroth exists somewhere in this ambiguous space. Clearly Campbell's creation, but elaborated by game designers, referenced by various authors, depicted by artists working from second-hand descriptions. Which version is real within fictional framework? Chaos magic practitioners represent unexpected appropriation. This postmodern occult movement, emerging in 1970s Britain, treats all belief systems as potentially valid tools for affecting reality. Practitioners deliberately invoke fictional entities. Characters from comic books, literary creations, invented gods, arguing that belief itself generates power regardless of origin. Some chaos magicians have incorporated Ghroth into ritual work, creating ceremonies ostensibly designed to align with cosmic cycles or harness Harbinger energies. This transforms Campbell's literary creation into actual magical practice, blurring fiction and religion in ways that would likely disturb the rationalist Campbell himself. The Simon Necronomicon, 1977. And similar grimoires demonstrate how fictional texts become quasi-religious documents. Someone writes horror fiction inventing forbidden books. Others create physical versions of these books. Eventually, people treat them as genuine occult material, performing rituals from texts they know originated in fiction but invest with sincere belief anyway. Ghroth hasn't received this treatment as extensively as more famous mythos entities, but references appear in modern grimoire compilations, instructions for supposedly invoking or protecting against its influence, sigils meant to represent its essence. The entity migrates from Campbell's stories into actual magical practice, however dubious that practice's efficacy. This raises philosophical question about when literary creation becomes religious text. Christianity's Gospels were written decades after events they describe, compiled by authors with theological agendas. Does temporal distance from originating author determine whether text is fiction or scripture? If enough people treat Campbell's revelations of Ghroth as genuine rather than invented source, does collective belief retroactively change its status? The question has no clear answer, but Ghroth's journey from story to statistic to sigil demonstrates how easily the boundary between literature and belief dissolves. Astronomical community awareness remains minimal but not non-existent. The International Astronomical Union, responsible for naming celestial bodies, has approved various Mythos-inspired names: Asteroid 9910 Cthulhu, Pluto's Cthulhu Regio Region, Saturn Moon Cthulhu. Ghroth hasn't achieved this official recognition, perhaps because it remains less culturally visible than Lovecraft's major creations. But the precedent exists. Fiction influences how we name actual cosmos, which creates strange feedback where invented entities become official designations for real astronomical features. This doesn't make Ghroth real, but it demonstrates how thoroughly fictional mythology has penetrated scientific nomenclature. The anxiety Ghroth generates differs from standard apocalyptic dread precisely because it operates through celestial mechanics rather than divine caprice or human folly. Nuclear war remains theoretically preventable through diplomacy and restraint. Climate collapse might be mitigated through coordinated action. Asteroid impacts can potentially be deflected given sufficient warning and technology. But an entity following orbital path, emitting wake-up call to sleeping gods as it passes. This allows no intervention point. You cannot negotiate with an orbit. You cannot engineer solution to cosmic alarm clock. The dread becomes pure and helpless, anticipation without possibility of action. This maps disturbingly well onto modern existential anxieties. We live with knowledge of multiple extinction-level threats operating on different timescales. Climate change unfolds across decades, visible in data and increasingly in weather patterns, yet political and economic systems respond inadequately. The threat is real, the timeline calculable, and collective action remains insufficient despite awareness. This mirrors Ghroth's horror structure, knowing catastrophe approaches, being able to track its progress, and discovering that knowledge changes nothing about outcome. The parallel isn't exact, but it's close enough that Campbell's astronomical harbinger feels like metaphor for every slow disaster we can measure but not prevent. Philosophical questions Ghroth raises resist comfortable resolution. If cosmic cycles operate beyond human influence, determining when civilizations rise and fall according to astronomical schedule, what meaning does human endeavor possess? The standard existentialist response: that we create meaning through our choices despite cosmic indifference, becomes harder to maintain when the indifference operates on predictable timetable. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, that we define ourselves through action. But what actions matter when a celestial body will eventually pass overhead and wake entities that reorganize reality according to their needs rather than ours? The cyclical nature of Campbell's vision proves particularly disturbing. Ghroth has passed before. Civilizations existed, thrived, and then encountered its influence. They're gone now, erased thoroughly enough that we don't recognize their archaeological traces or misinterpret them as natural formations. This suggests our current civilization occupies the same position, temporary flourishing between passages, building monuments and technologies and cultures that will be swept away when the harbinger returns. We're not the first, won't be the last, and nothing we create will survive the cycle. This renders all human achievement provisional, all progress temporary, all meaning contingent on occupying the interval between catastrophes. Yet Campbell's genius lies in never confirming this interpretation definitively. Perhaps Ghroth's effects vary. Perhaps Earth has been lucky, positioned where its passage produces minimal disruption. Perhaps previous civilizations collapsed for unrelated reasons and were retroactively attributing their fall to cosmic cause. The uncertainty means we cannot even achieve the cold comfort of certainty about our doom. We don't know for sure that Ghroth will destroy us. We just suspect it might, and this suspicion corrodes every foundation we attempt to build. Modern relevance becomes inescapable when examining pandemic response, climate science communication, or any scenario where experts warn about calculable future disaster and populations respond with denial, panic, or fatalistic acceptance. Ghroth crystallizes this dynamic into single entity. The astronomers who calculate its orbit become prophets nobody wants to believe. The historical evidence of previous passages becomes suppressed or reinterpreted. The approaching date generates competing responses, preparation that feels futile, denial that feels necessary for psychological survival, fatalism that permits continuing normal life until normalcy ends. We've seen these exact patterns in how societies respond to actual existential threats. The appeal of scheduled apocalypse in an age of ambient dread deserves examination. Modern existence includes constant low-level awareness of multiple potential catastrophes. Nuclear exchange, climate collapse, pandemic, artificial intelligence risks, various other scenarios where human extinction or civilizational collapse becomes plausible. This ambient dread lacks specific focus or timeline, which makes it psychologically corrosive. Ghroth offers something almost comforting by comparison: specific threat, calculable arrival, defined mechanism. Knowing exactly when and how the world ends provides strange relief compared to vague awareness that it might end in any number of ways at any time. Campbell's marginal status within his own creation enhances its psychological potency. If everyone knew about Ghroth, if it appeared in major films and became household name like Cthulhu, the entity would lose power through overexposure. Instead, it remains somewhat obscure, discovered rather than encountered everywhere. This mirrors how actual existential risks work. Most people don't spend much time contemplating asteroid impacts or gamma-ray bursts, but those who do research these threats experience particular form of dread that their knowledge isolates them from general population. Ghroth operates similarly. Once you know about it, you cannot unknow it, and this knowledge separates you from those who remain happily ignorant. The entity we cannot not think about, once encountered, demonstrates horror's ability to colonize consciousness. Reading about Ghroth changes how you observe night sky. Comets become possible harbingers. Astronomical news about unusual orbital calculations triggers associations with Campbell's fiction. The boundary between literary creation and genuine anxiety dissolves, not because you believe Ghroth literally exists, but because the concept it embodies. Scheduled extinction via cosmic mechanism accurately describes actual possibilities. Campbell created metaphor so apt that it functions as lens for viewing real astronomical and existential threats. The mark Ghroth leaves differs from Cthulhu's tentacles or Nyarlathotep's thousand masks. Those entities offer visceral imagery, specific features to visualize and fear. Ghroth offers only approach, only inevitability, only the calendar counting down toward date you calculated yourself using math you cannot dispute. This makes it perhaps the purest expression of cosmic horror Campbell achieved, not monster to fight, not God to appease, simply mechanism of universe that operates regardless of human response. We are here. It is coming. These facts exist in relation to each other, and nothing we do changes that relationship. The philosophical implication Campbell never quite states but implies throughout: perhaps the most terrifying aspect of cosmos isn't that it doesn't care about humanity, but that it operates according to rules that occasionally produce our extinction as side effect. Not targeted, not noticed, simply eliminated by processes following their natural course. Ghroth embodies this perfectly, the harbinger that heralds not because anyone sent it, but because that's what happens when it passes. We're caught in mechanism we didn't create, serving purposes we don't understand, awaiting event we can predict but not prevent. And somewhere out there, following its patient ellipse through the dark between stars, Ghroth continues its orbit, indifferent to whether we've calculated when it returns.